Well, as Katie just mentioned, the war in Gaza is posing a risk to Biden's re-election bid. Last night, the U.S. president expressed optimism that a ceasefire deal could be struck by next week. But today, both Hamas and Israel played down that talk. Hamas wants a permanent halt to fighting, while Israel is reportedly only interested in a 6-week pause. And any pause depends on the release of Israeli hostages.
You see, from Israel's point of view, we are willing. But the question remains whether Hamas are willing. Hamas are making outlandish demands in another orbit, another planet. If Hamas can come back down to reality, we'll be able to have a deal.
Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He previously served as a U.S. State Department official working on Middle East policy and the Arab-Israel peace process. Aaron David Miller, it's good to speak with you again.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder where you think we are in these negotiations. Joe Biden sounded very optimistic. Hamas, though, pouring cold water on the notion that a hostage deal is close. Where do you think these talks are at this point?
I think we're closer now than we ever have been since the mid-November exchange. And this will be more consequential in the sense that it's going to result, hopefully, in a 45-day humanitarian extension, cessation of hostilities, temporary ceasefire, however you want to describe it. It could lead, because time is critical here, and time as an ally is 45 days, it could lead to a significant surge of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. It'll lead to a de-escalation, at least during the 6-week period of Israeli military activity. It could lead, assuming the parties agree, to a return of Palestinian civilians to northern Gaza from their crowded quarters and areas now in Khan Yunis and Rafah. And it might, although I'm not terribly encouraged, perhaps create some sort of transition to a more permanent de-escalation. But I think it's important that it be reached, because without disagreement, I fear the situation is going to get worse before it gets worse.
Just on that, the idea of a permanent de-escalation, this is one of the conditions Hamas has on the table, that they won't agree to anything unless it leads to a permanent ceasefire. Even though Israeli negotiators have reportedly signaled they could release a group of high-profile Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Israeli hostages. These are prisoners that would have been convicted of very serious offenses. But do you see the permanent ceasefire being on the table here, or that Hamas could settle for less than the permanent ceasefire?
I don't, because the objectives and the interests of Israel and Hamas are still mutually irreconcilable. Israel is determined, no matter how long it takes, to continue to degrade Hamas's military capacity, to kill its senior leaders, and ultimately, I think, to erode its sovereignty in Gaza. That is to say, its capacity to influence the politics of Gaza, the economy of Gaza, and certainly the security of Gaza. And Hamas is determined to resist. I think it's going to be extremely difficult for the Israelis to eradicate this organization. And one of the problems we're going to run into in the day after, is that any Palestinian governing structure linked to the Palestinian Authority, to the PLO, a technocratic government, is going to be hostage in many respects to Hamas's intimidation, its co-optation. So I think this is something that no one, I think, has been able to get their arms around. And as of yet, no one has been able to come up with a security structure for the day after, or a political structure, Palestinians governing Gaza, which is free from Hamas influence.
The hope is that this can maybe be done by the start of Ramadan, which starts on the 10th of March. Do you think that's a realistic time window for something to get done, given the obstacles?
I mean, my experience with Middle East negotiations, and let's be clear, this is an extraordinary negotiation. The key decision maker is meters below ground. Both parties are pledged to the other's destruction. It's being handled indirectly. Everybody has an agenda. So in that case, my own view is, and I think the last several months bear me out, that these negotiations only have 2 speeds, slow and slower. But I think there is some urgency now. I think it's a reasonable hope that by the beginning of Ramadan, you could see this limited 45 hostages roughly for 45 days of quiet.
So Joe Biden hoped to have it done by the start of this weekend, the end of this weekend is what he laid out yesterday. Is he speaking to a domestic audience with those words? He's got a big primary with a potential like opt-out voting protest movement happening in Michigan. What do you make of his target audience and how this is affecting him domestically?
I mean, I think Joe Biden he has an emotional stake in this. Certainly, he's high regard for the security of Israel, the people of Israel, the idea of Israel. He's less able as eloquently to express his concern in regard for Palestinian aspirations or even the loss of life, exponential loss of life among Palestinians. But I think Joe Biden's objective right now is to get a deal, because without a deal, the U.S. has no policy toward this war. Without a deal, the political implications, I think, for the president are quite fraught. He needs to see the pictures change in Gaza. He needs to see the Israelis de-escalate, and he needs to see humanitarian assistance, not dribble into Gaza, surge into Gaza. And I think to some degree he was leaning out over his skis today. He actually said he thought by Monday that there'd be a deal. And you know, the primary rule of a good negotiator is not to be in more of a hurry than the parties you're negotiating with, because otherwise the price goes up. So
Yeah.
I don't think he's done damage at all to the prospects. I think this will be determined as to whether or not Israel and Hamas feel at this stage of their conflict that their mutual needs and requirements with respect to this exchange and this arrangement can be met. That's the key. And we need to remind ourselves, final point, that no matter what kind of influence external parties think they have, this conflict from October 7th to where we are now has been driven by the two parties. The tone, the objectives have been shaped and molded primarily by Israel and Hamas. And that's such a simple fact, but I think it's too often lost sight of.
No, I think that's a very good point to make, and because they have their domestic politics that they are responding to, and their domestic situations they're responding to, and Joe Biden has that in the U.S. He's got a big primary in Michigan tonight. There's a big Muslim population in that state, and it is a critical state on the presidential map for President Biden. Depending on how this goes, how do you think that could affect the administration's policy on this going forward, if there's a rebuke or a protest there for President Biden in a key state like this?
Yeah, it's hard to know. And I think on one key issue, which is the U.S.-Israeli relationship, the President of the United States has refrained from exercising on paper at least the leverage he could have used. He could slow walk, restrict, or condition U.S. military assistance to Israel. Hasn't done that. He could change our voting posture in New York, in the UN, abstaining or voting for a UN General Assembly resolution, or more importantly, a UN Security Council resolution. Or he could have created a much different rhetorical frame in which day after day he would simply say, this government, this Israeli government, is undermining the values and the interests that have made the U.S.-Israeli relationship as resilient and potent as it is. He could continue to build that frame, but he hasn't done any of those things. And I suspect it's driven by the fact that he has this emotional commitment to Israel. It's driven by domestic politics. Remember, the Republican Party, the progressives may be pushing, and the Democrats may be pushing the administration to be tougher on Israel. The Republican Party, which is the Israel Can Do No Wrong Party, is basically waiting for Joe Biden to appear as if he's pressuring the Israelis during this crisis. So he's got politics, he's got his own persona, and he's got some very difficult policy choices here. I wonder sometimes how the U.S. military would have behaved. Well, we saw to some degree in the wake of 9/11, which resulted in the two longest wars in American history. And we willingly, inadvertently, consciously, or unwilling or not, caused the death of hundreds of thousands of Afghans and Iraqis. So I think he's bound by these constraints. And I suspect unless the Israelis do something that is so egregious, to use the president's words, so over the top and then some, I suspect he's going to try to manage his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu rather than to create a sustained public breach and figuratively speaking, go to war with the prime minister.
Aaron David Miller, we always appreciate the time and the insights. It's Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.